Howdy, y'all. I was going to talk about fine-tuning today, but I decided instead to talk about teleological arguments in general. There are different kinds of teleological arguments. A teleological argument is any argument from design to a designer. Any kind of design to a designer type argument. So the first time I ever heard of a teleological argument was back in 1998 in my freshman philosophy class. William Paley, and it was in one of those anthologies, one of those philosophy anthologies. So you always get kind of a truncated version of the argument there because you're just a freshman, it's just an introductory to philosophy class. But I remember of all the arguments I heard about God early on, that was the least persuasive to me. And part of the reason it wasn't very persuasive to me was because it was a probabilistic argument. It was an argument based on probability, which I guess is what probabilistic arguments are. But and I guess maybe back then I was a lot more concerned about certainty back then than I am now. That was one thing. Another thing is I guess part of the problem I had with probabilistic arguments wasn't just that they gave you less than certainty, but it was also the fact that as long as it's probable that such and such is the case, then it's possible for it to not be the case. And so it seemed to me that improbable things happen all the time. And so the fact that life is improbable is not a reason to think that it couldn't have happened without a God or something like that, or without a designer. That was one objection I had. The other objection I had was that any configuration of parts is equally improbable. Any shuffling of the cards is equally improbable. If you took a bunch of pennies and you threw them all up into the ground, no matter how they land, the exact position of every penny is going to be extremely improbable, and yet it's got to land somehow. Back then, I thought that was a good argument. It turns out that's actually a terrible argument because it's not just complexity that's under issue. It's what's called specified complexity. And Richard Dawkins has a big section near the beginning of his book, The Blind Watchmaker, in which he explains what specified complexity means. It doesn't simply mean, complex. It means like a special circumstance under which a combination of parts are able to accomplish something, to swing through trees, to fly through the air, to gather food, to reproduce, all these different functions and stuff. So he said there's something that things like airplanes and people and trees have in common that are not had by other things, rivers, rocks, things like that. Even though they may be equally well, I don't even know if that's true that they're equally complex. But anyway, I'm not the best at explaining that. But I should also say that I guess part of the problem I don't find, or I haven't found, teleological arguments very persuasive is because they seem to require understanding things a lot better than I typically do. We've come a long way since William Paley. Now, the primary teleological arguments are arguments from biological life on the one hand, and we know a lot more about biological life now than we used to. And then there's the fine-tuning argument. Concerning biological life, there are two arguments from design. There's the argument from the origin of life, and then there's the argument from just biological complexity in general. I guess arguments against evolution or something like that. But Charles Darwin had a lot to do with why William Paley's argument fell out of favor, because William Paley's argument made a lot of sense to people because, human bodies are machines, basically, but like watches. But Darwin showed how it's possible to get the kind of complexity that you see in biological life through purely natural processes. And so that eliminated any need for a designer. But there were things that Darwin said in his book that would undermine his theory. And the people in the intelligent design community think that we found those things in biological life, and one of them is irreducible complexity. And this is the idea that if you got some machine that's made up of multiple parts that all kind of work together in unison, there's no way to build that machine in a piecemeal kind of way, because if you remove one part of it, the whole thing just doesn't function anymore. In the Dover trial, what's his name? Michael Behe brought up one of these arguments from irreducible complexity. I think he used the bacterial flagellum or something like that, a little rotary motor that exists in a bacteria. And I think the response was to show up the next day. The response from the other side was to show up the next day with mouse traps. Oh yeah, that's what he did. Michael Behe used the mousetrap as an example of irreducible complexity. You know, it's got all these different parts, and if you remove any one part, then the whole thing will no longer work. So it would be a huge coincidence if all these parts happened to just evolve until they just all came together and made a mousetrap all of a sudden. So a mousetrap is the kind of thing that couldn't have evolved. And so the argument on the other side is that, well, parts that don't function in a mousetrap can be used in other ways. And so they showed up the next day with mousetraps holding their tie together. And so they showed that if you can remove part of the mousetrap and it still has some function, it may not have the same function, but it has a function. So at the time when I was, learning about all this kind of stuff, I just kind of figured I don't know enough about biology to really be able to tell who's right in this situation. I don't know if anything actually is irreducibly complex. I read about examples like the bacterial flagellum and stuff like that, but apparently, the experts don't find that very persuasive. But there was something that Richard Dawkins said. He wrote about it in The Blind Watchmaker, and he also repeated it in The God Delusion. And it was the fact that some things are built up through scaffolding, and this scaffolding keeps everything together, makes everything work and stuff. And then when you remove the scaffolding, you've got something that works. Then it looks like it's irreducibly complex, because it's true that if you remove one part, the thing won't function. But it could have been built up through previously existing scaffolding that has now become dormant. And we have like dormant genes in us, so we know scaffolding is a real thing. There are, what do they call it, vestigial organs and things like that. So I thought Dawkins made a pretty good case for the fact that even if we come across things that appear to be irreducibly complex, we can't know for sure that they're irreducibly complex in the sense that they couldn't have been built up, since there could have been previously existing scaffolding. And I thought that's a pretty good argument. I guess one reason I didn't find arguments from biological complexity very persuasive is just because of my lack of knowledge and understanding of biology. In the 7th grade, they teach you biology. You learn about cells and you dissect worms and all that kind of stuff. But in high school, I didn't take any biology classes. I was interested in physics and chemistry and astronomy and geology and stuff like that. I took all the science classes I could because I loved science back then, but I didn't take any biology. And when I got to college, I didn't take any biology. And so, I basically had a 7th grade education in biology. So I didn't even understand the difference between a chromosome and a DNA molecule. I knew that there was some relationship between them, but I didn't know what it was. I had a vague understanding of what genes were and proteins. I didn't have any idea what a protein was. I knew that meat had protein in it. That's about all I knew. But, there have been various times over the last 20 years when I've tried to educate myself in biology, and it's been kind of a struggle. And I guess the first breakthrough I had was when I read Stephen Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell. He explained a lot of things on an 8th grade level that I understood, and things finally started to click, and I started reading stuff. And where I've come down now, I believe in evolution. And let me explain the reason why. There's a lot of arguments for evolution, but I want to explain the one that was like the turning point for me. Everybody has a unique DNA in the sense that nobody's sequence is exactly the same. However, we do share genes in common. We have a lot of genes. I think we have all of our genes in common if you're human. But in each of those genes, there are small differences. They're just like one, I forget what they're called. Let me just talk about proteins. Genes code for proteins. And so you take a little section of DNA and it creates an RNA, and that RNA goes somewhere else and they create a protein. And a protein is just a string of amino acids. And I think there's like 4 different kinds. I can't remember how many there are. Anyway, a protein is a string of amino acids that are put in a specific sequence. And there's nothing determined about that sequence. They could be in any sequence. But it's in a specific sequence, and that sequence results in it folding up in a certain way and creating a shape. And because of its shape, it can have some kind of function. So to use an analogy, it might create something like a bolt, or something like a nut, or a bracket, or a pump, or something, some kind of mechanical part. And so these parts, the shapes of these parts, are determined by this sequence. But it's possible to replace an amino acid here or there and not affect the shape. And so your gene that creates a certain protein and my gene that creates that same protein are not necessarily identical in their sequence. They may have 1 or 2 things different. So if you inherit a gene from your mom and you inherit a different gene from your dad and stuff, there's going to be differences. I mean, you can look at the sequences in your proteins and stuff and be able to determine whether you got it from your mom or from your dad. And so this kind of works. You can create a whole family tree just by looking at people's proteins and their genes and stuff like that, their DNA. You can work out a family tree and find out exactly how everybody's related to everybody else. And you can figure out, based on these similarities and differences, how far back your common ancestor is. If you're meeting somebody that you don't think you're related to, you can find out how far back your common ancestor is, stuff like that. That's how those DNA tests like 23andMe work. I guess it's how they work. They figure out, where your ancestry is based on these slight differences in your genes and stuff. And so it turns out that that we also share all, or most, not all, but a lot of our genes in common with other species, even bananas. We have a lot of genes in common with bananas. But the differences between them are more significant. And so you can create the same family tree between different species, and you can show that they're related. Now you might think it's just it's contrived to say, okay, if I look at the gene in a banana and I look at the same gene in a human, and they have certain similarities and certain differences, that I'm just assuming that the difference is because they have a common ancestor. But here's the thing. You don't have to do that with just one gene or one protein. You can do it with multiple genes and multiple proteins, and each one of them will tell the same story. That's got to be more than a coincidence. So it seems to me almost certain that common descent, or I forget what they call it, but basically there's just one family tree here on Earth. Everything's kind of related to everybody else. And so because of that, evolution seems pretty obvious. And so I believe in evolution. Now, whether the mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection by themselves are sufficient to account for all the diversity of life we have on Earth, I don't know that. I don't see how I could know that. Maybe if I learned more biology, I could. Now, I believe that God is sovereign over everything. And so I believe that God was involved in the whole process. I mean, he obviously has an intention for humans to have come into existence. So he had to have manipulated things in such a way as to guarantee that humans would arise somehow. So I do think, I guess you could call me a theistic evolutionist now. I don't make any claims about the mechanism God used or at what point in history he intervened or something, but I do think he probably did intervene. It may be that we couldn't have gotten here without God, but basically it's mostly for theological reasons that I believe God was involved. It's not for scientific reasons. There may be scientific reasons for why God had to have been involved to have created as much diversity as there is on life, but I have no way of knowing that because I don't know enough about biology to make that determination. So basically, most of the intelligent design arguments I don't find terribly persuasive, but the primary reason I don't find them persuasive is just because of my lack of knowledge in biology. Now, since I brought up Steve Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell, I want to say something about that. His argument there was that he was arguing not from just biological complexity, but from information. And he explains that there's different kinds of information. And I don't remember all the different kinds. I remember him talking about Shannon information, which I think is like a kind of repetitive thing like you might see in a crystal. You have the same pattern that's just repeated over and over and over again. But the information that exists in DNA is very similar to the information that you would see in like a computer code, whether you're talking about C++ or Python or whatever. You've got this code written out, and this code allows these functions to take place in a computer. Well, in the same way, a DNA molecule has a specific code, a sequence of characters that from which are created proteins, and the proteins are like parts that work in a biological organism or something like that. So it contains that kind of information. Well, his argument is that since minds are the only thing we know of that are capable of producing that kind of information, it follows that the best explanation for the information we see in the DNA molecule is a mind. Now, to me, on the one hand, I think that's a pretty reasonable argument. If you want to limit your explanatory resources to known sources of information, then yeah, I think that makes sense. But if you're trying to adjudicate between the question of whether a mind is necessary to create life or whether, just natural processes could produce the same information, then I think it's a question-begging argument. Because by saying that minds are the only things capable of producing information, you're just assuming that nature is not capable of doing the same thing. And so it's a question-begging argument. And so I don't think it's very persuasive. If any of you think that I've misunderstood his arguments, please leave me a comment. So as far as the origin of life is concerned, I think this is a better argument for design than the argument from irreducible complexity or information in the DNA. But the strength of this argument is also the weakness, and it's our lack of information. It's our lack of knowledge of how exactly what the chemical pathway was from the basic building blocks of biological organisms like amino acids to a whole cell, a functioning cell. We don't know what the chemical pathway is. We haven't figured it out yet. So it seems to me that the argument there is kind of an argument from ignorance. And so I don't find that to be a persuasive argument. Maybe there's more to that one, I don't know either. But there are some things we can talk about. Like, for example, on the one hand, there's, as far as we can tell, there's only one family tree, which means that life only happened one time on this planet. It only started one time. That tells me maybe life is rare. Maybe it's a really improbable thing to have happened. Just the difficulty we've had in figuring out how to get from the basic building blocks to a fully functioning cell just through natural chemical processes and stuff. Just the difficulty scientists have had in solving this problem seems to me to suggest that whatever happened was probably a highly unlikely event. It was highly improbable or something. Now, I think it's very difficult to say how improbable it was, and it seems possible. I've heard a lot of people, whenever this Fermi paradox comes up, I hear a lot of people saying, well, there must be, the universe must be teeming with life because it's so big and there's so much explanatory resources. There's so many opportunities. We've had, 13 something billion years for it to happen. There's trillions and trillions and trillions of planets, so there's all these opportunities for life. Surely, no matter how improbable life is, it had to have emerged. Well, we don't know that because we don't know how it started. And since we don't know how it started, we can't say how probable or improbable it was. It has to be like, say that there are 10 to 100 opportunities for life to have emerged on this planet. Well, if it turns out that the odds of life beginning on any particular planet is something like 1 to the 200, well, then the probabilistic resources in the universe would not be sufficient to explain why life exists. And so before we can say, how likely it is that life would exist anywhere in the universe, we have to know how likely it was that the particular chemical processes that created us could have happened on their own. And so, although I think that arguments from the improbability of life spontaneously emerging has some merit, I don't think it's the strongest argument just because we don't know enough. Let me mention one other argument about the origin of life that I do think has some merit, but I have some reservations about it. And it's it's a mathematical argument based on, what the probability is of producing one functional protein. For a protein to be functional, like I said before, you can put these amino acids, you can string them together in any order you want. But of all the possible sequences that you could have in an amino acid of like a given length, say 100, let's just say 100 amino acids long. They're like I don't know what the number is, but they're like a whole bunch of possibilities for it to, of possible sequences that it could have, possible orders of the amino acids. Boy, I'm terrible explaining things. But there's a very small number of them. There's a very small number of sequences that would create a functional protein. The rest of them would just create rubbish. And so it turns out that even if you're generous about the explanatory resources of the universe, if you imagine that every planet is just constantly trying out different sequences, maybe 1 per second per planet, 1 per second, 1 per second. Oh, I'm not doing very well here. Anyway, basically the argument is that even given all the explanatory resources in the universe, there would not have been enough time to have tried out enough sequence to make it probable that we would have gotten even one single functional protein. I think that argument has some merit. I even saw a YouTube video with Richard Dawkins on it and all the smart people talking about the mathematical difficulties of evolution. And so it's not something that Christian apologists just made up. I mean, this is a real issue in biology. One of the reasons I don't find it all that persuasive is because it seems to me that any protein can be functional depending on its environment. What makes a bolt functional is that it fits inside a nut. And what makes a nut functional is that it fits over a bolt. So if you had a bolt without a nut, it wouldn't be functional. And so functionality is a feature of whole systems and stuff. And it doesn't seem as improbable to me that you could have a bunch of just random proteins interacting with each other, and a few of them just kind of by chance fit together in some special way or something. And because of that, natural selection may take over. Of course, you'd have to have a self-replicating molecule. I think that's one of the difficulties in the origin of life. So, yeah. Basically, I think these arguments have some merit. I think they're definitely worth considering. But for me personally, they're not that persuasive simply because of my lack of knowledge and understanding. Maybe someday I'll have stronger opinions about them. But the argument I want to talk about in the next video is fine-tuning. And this one, I do think I'm starting to get a really good handle on. This was another argument that didn't used to be very persuasive to me, but just in recent years, it has started to become persuasive to me. So I'm going to talk about that one in the next video, unless I come up with something else. So there you have it. Thanks for coming.